It was an ordinary morning at the airport. The terminal buzzed with the energy of countless travelers, each on their own journey. The sound of rolling suitcases echoed against the walls, blending with announcements from the overhead speakers and the occasional laughter of excited families heading off on vacations. A sea of faces moved through the space, some hurried, some calm, and some clearly stressed as they fumbled with tickets or struggled to keep track of children. Among this crowd stood Mia Daniels, her calm demeanor a striking contrast to the chaos around her. Her suitcase was small but immaculate, the kind that spoke of someone who packed thoughtfully and efficiently. Her outfit was simple but elegant, exuding a quiet confidence. She didn't fidget with her phone or glance nervously at the departure board. Instead, she stood with a poise that seemed almost out of place amidst the frenetic energy of the airport. To the airline crew stationed at the check-in counter, Mia was just another passenger in a long line. She wasn't dressed in designer labels or flaunting expensive jewelry, so they didn't think twice about her. They barely noticed her at all, really. To them, she was just a face in the crowd, someone they would serve and forget within minutes. But Mia noticed everything. She observed the way the crew at the counter interacted with passengers. She saw the smiles they reserved for certain travelers, those who looked wealthy or influential. And she noticed the way their expressions changed when someone they deemed ordinary approached. Their tones became curt, their smiles vanished, and their patience seemed to evaporate. When it was finally Mia's turn, she stepped forward with her ticket in hand. The lead crew member barely glanced at her before sighing loudly, as if serving her was an inconvenience. "How can I help you?" the woman asked in a tone that was anything but helpful. Mia smiled politely. "I'd like to inquire about an upgrade to first class, please." The crew member blinked, then looked Mia up and down, her eyes scanning Mia's modest attire. There was a pause, followed by a smirk. "First class," the woman repeated, her voice dripping with skepticism. She exchanged a glance with her colleague, who stifled a laugh. "Yes," Mia replied evenly. Her tone was calm, unbothered by the crew's reaction. The woman at the counter raised an eyebrow and leaned closer, as if she hadn't heard correctly. "You want an upgrade to first class?" "Yes," Mia said again, her voice steady. She slid her ticket across the counter. Behind the desk, the crew couldn't contain their amusement. One of them chuckled softly, and another muttered something under their breath. The group shared a laugh, their eyes darting back to Mia as if she couldn't see or hear them. Mia stood silently, her expression unreadable. She didn't respond to their mocking tone or the laughter that followed. Instead, she waited patiently as the woman at the counter pretended to check the availability of an upgrade. "I'm sorry," the woman said finally, though her tone lacked any real sincerity. "There's nothing available." Mia nodded. "Thank you," she said simply, retrieving her ticket and stepping aside. As she walked away, she could still hear their laughter behind her. "She really thought she could just walk up and ask for first class," one of them said, loud enough for Mia to hear. "Maybe she doesn't know how expensive it is," another added, their voice filled with condescension. The comments stung, but Mia didn't let it show. She had dealt with people like this before, people who judged her based on her appearance, who assumed they knew her worth without knowing anything about her. It wasn't the first time, and it likely wouldn't be the last. But what the crew didn't know was that Mia Daniels was far from ordinary. She wasn't just another passenger in the economy section. In fact, she wasn't even just a traveler heading to her destination. Mia Daniels was a woman with influence, power, and the ability to change lives both for better and worse. As she found her seat and settled in, Mia's mind was already at work. She wasn't the type to react impulsively or make a scene. No, Mia believed in patience and precision. She believed in observing, gathering information, and waiting for the perfect moment to act. The crew's laughter and dismissive attitude had set something in motion, though they couldn't possibly know it yet. To them, she was just another face in the crowd, someone they could mock and forget about. But Mia wouldn't forget. And soon, neither would they. In the bustling terminal, with planes taking off and landing, the day seemed like any other. But for the airline crew who had laughed at Mia Daniels, it was a day that would change their lives forever. Mia leaned back in her seat, her face calm but her thoughts racing. The economy cabin was filling up quickly, passengers bustling to stow their luggage and find their assigned spots. She didn't mind sitting in economy after all, it wasn't about the seat. It was about respect, something the crew clearly didn't think she deserved. As the minutes passed, Mia watched the crew move up and down the aisle, helping passengers with luggage or directing them to their seats. She noticed how their attitudes shifted depending on who they were talking to. For the well-dressed businessman in a tailored suit, their smiles were warm and accommodating. For the elderly woman struggling with a heavy bag, they offered only impatience and muttered comments about holding up the line. Mia took it all in, her eyes sharp and observant. She had a habit of noticing details others overlooked, a skill that had served her well in her career. And right now, those details were painting a picture of a crew that lacked professionalism and respect for their passengers. A faint hum of conversation filled the cabin as passengers settled in. Some flipped through magazines, while others scrolled on their phones. Mia pulled out a small notebook and began jotting down notes, her pen moving swiftly across the page. She wasn't writing for herself, though. These notes would serve another purpose, one the crew couldn't begin to imagine. As the flight prepared for takeoff, the lead flight attendant Nancy, as her name tag read, made an announcement over the intercom. Her voice was chipper but rehearsed, devoid of genuine warmth. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard Flight 327. Please ensure your seat belts are fastened, your tray tables are stowed, and all carry-on items are securely placed in the overhead bins or under the seat in front of you. We hope you enjoy your flight." Mia noticed how Nancy's tone was slightly more enthusiastic when she addressed the first-class cabin, which was separated from economy by a simple curtain. The division was symbolic, but it felt palpable, an invisible line that determined who was worthy of their best service and who wasn't. As the plane ascended into the sky, Mia glanced out the window. The clouds were a stark white against the endless blue, a sight that usually brought her peace. But today, her thoughts were elsewhere. She couldn't stop replaying the scene at the counter in her mind, the dismissive glances, the laughter, the mocking tone. It wasn't the first time she had faced this kind of treatment, but it still struck a nerve. And while she could have brushed it off as another instance of ignorance, something about this time felt different. Mia turned her attention back to her notebook. The pages were filling quickly, each line a record of the crew's behavior. She wasn't just documenting their actions out of frustration, she had a plan. And by the end of this flight, that plan would be set in motion. As the flight attendants began their service, the differences in their treatment of passengers became even more apparent. In first class, they moved with practiced elegance, pouring champagne and addressing passengers by name. In economy, their movements were rushed and mechanical, their smiles barely masking their impatience. When they reached Mia's row, Nancy barely looked at her. "Would you like something to drink?" she asked, her tone flat. "Water, please," Mia replied, her voice polite but firm. Nancy handed her the plastic cup without a word, then moved on to the next passenger. Mia watched her closely, noting the stark contrast in how she interacted with others. As the flight continued, Mia began to notice other details, small things that spoke volumes about the crew's attitude. The way they rolled their eyes when passengers made simple requests. The way they whispered to each other, glancing at passengers and laughing quietly. It was clear they thought no one was paying attention. But Mia was. Halfway through the flight, there was a small commotion in the economy cabin. A mother traveling with a young child was struggling to calm her crying toddler. The child's wails echoed through the cabin, drawing annoyed glances from other passengers. Nancy approached the mother with a forced smile. "Ma'am, could you please try to keep your child quiet? It's disturbing the other passengers." The mother looked flustered. "I'm trying, but he's teething, and he's in pain. I'm so sorry for the noise." Nancy sighed loudly, her patience clearly wearing thin. "Well, perhaps you should have considered that before flying. Please handle it." The mother's face turned red with embarrassment, and she turned away, cradling her child and whispering soothing words. Mia felt a surge of anger rise within her. The lack of empathy was staggering. Mia reached into her bag and pulled out a small travel kit. She stood up and approached the mother, offering her a teething toy she had packed. "Here, try this," Mia said with a kind smile. The mother looked up, her eyes brimming with gratitude. "Thank you so much," she whispered, taking the toy and offering it to her child. As Mia returned to her seat, she caught a glimpse of Nancy's expression, annoyance mixed with confusion. It was clear she hadn't expected anyone to step in. The rest of the flight passed uneventfully, but the tension lingered in the air. Mia remained quiet, observing and taking notes, her mind working tirelessly. By the time the plane began its descent, she had everything she needed. As the wheels touched down on the runway, Mia felt a sense of calm wash over her. The journey was over, but the real story was just beginning. When the plane reached the gate and the seatbelt sign turned off, passengers began gathering their belongings and preparing to disembark. The crew stood by the exit, their smiles plastered on as they bid passengers goodbye. Mia waited until the aisle cleared before standing. She moved deliberately, her notebook tucked securely under her arm. As she approached the crew, Nancy offered her a practiced smile. "Thank you for flying with us," Nancy said, her tone devoid of any real warmth. Mia met her gaze, her own expression unreadable. "Oh, you'll be hearing from me," she said calmly, stepping past them and into the terminal. Nancy's smile faltered, and for the first time, there was a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. As Mia walked away, she felt a sense of determination settle over her. The crew might have underestimated her, but they were about to learn an important lesson, one they wouldn't forget anytime soon. Mia stepped toward the counter with her usual calm confidence, her heels clicking softly against the polished airport floor. She carried herself with a grace that didn't demand attention but naturally drew it anyway. In her hand, she held her ticket, neatly tucked into a leather travel wallet. Her approach was deliberate, her pace unhurried, even as the line behind her grew longer. The crew at the counter didn't notice her at first, too engrossed in their chatter. They exchanged stories about their morning, punctuated by bursts of laughter that seemed a bit too loud for the professional setting. One of them glanced up as Mia arrived and gave her a cursory look, just enough to register her presence but not enough to convey any genuine acknowledgement. "Next," the lead attendant called out, her tone clipped. Mia stepped forward, her smile polite and unwavering. "Good morning," she began, sliding her ticket across the counter. "I'd like to inquire about an upgrade to first class." The words seemed to hang in the air for a moment. The attendant, a woman named Sarah, her name tag slightly askew, paused, blinking as if she hadn't heard correctly. "First class?" Sarah repeated, her tone heavy with disbelief. "Yes," Mia replied, her voice steady. Sarah's lips twitched, threatening to form a smirk. She looked Mia up and down, her gaze lingering on Mia's simple yet elegant outfit. It wasn't designer, but it was well put together, practical for travel yet exuding quiet sophistication. Still, it wasn't the kind of attire Sarah associated with first-class passengers. "Are you sure?" Sarah asked, the mockery in her tone thinly veiled. Mia nodded. "Yes, I'd like to see if there are any upgrades available." Sarah didn't respond immediately. Instead, she turned to her colleague, a younger attendant named Jenna, and raised an eyebrow. Jenna leaned in, glancing briefly at Mia before covering her mouth with her hand to stifle a laugh. "You. Jenna said, her voice barely a whisper but loud enough for Mia to hear. She wants first class. Their laughter started as a stifled giggle, but it quickly grew louder, echoing in the space around them. A few passengers in line behind Mia shifted uncomfortably, glancing at each other and then at the scene unfolding before them. Mia remained composed, her expression calm as she watched the two attendants. She had encountered this kind of behavior before, condescension wrapped in thinly disguised amusement. It wasn't new, but that didn't make it any less irritating. Sarah leaned forward, her voice dripping with insincerity. "Let me check for you," she said, tapping a few keys on the keyboard with exaggerated slowness. Behind the counter, Jenna whispered something to another crew member, who glanced at Mia and smirked. The whispers were faint but unmistakable, carrying a tone of ridicule that was impossible to ignore. Mia waited patiently, her hands resting lightly on the counter. Her posture remained poised, betraying none of the irritation she felt bubbling beneath the surface. She had long mastered the art of composure, a skill that often left people underestimating her. Finally, Sarah looked up from the computer screen, her expression overly apologetic. "I'm sorry," she said, her tone far too sweet to be genuine. "There are no upgrades available." "None at all?" Mia asked, her voice still calm. "Nope," Sarah replied, popping the P at the end of the word for emphasis. "First class is completely full." Mia nodded. "Thank you for checking," she said, taking back her ticket. As she turned to leave, she heard Jenna whisper to Sarah, "She really thought she could get an upgrade. Can you believe that?" "Right," Sarah replied, loud enough for Mia to catch. "Some people don't know their place." The word stung, but Mia didn't let it show. She walked away with the same quiet confidence she had approached with, her head held high. Behind her, the laughter of the crew continued, each chuckle like a jab meant to belittle and demean. Mia found a seat in the waiting area and sat down, placing her ticket on the small table in front of her. She took a deep breath, allowing the anger to settle. This wasn't the first time she had encountered people who judged her based on surface-level impressions. It was a story she knew all too well, but it never failed to amaze her how blatant some people could be. She opened her bag and pulled out a small notebook, flipping to a blank page. Her pen moved swiftly across the paper as she began jotting down notes, her handwriting neat and deliberate. Dismissive attitude from counter staff. Mocking tone. Inappropriate comments overheard, some people don't know their place. Unprofessional behavior, laughing at a passenger. The list grew quickly as she documented every detail she could recall. Mia wasn't the type to let things slide, especially when it came to matters of respect and professionalism. She believed in accountability, in making sure people understood the consequences of their actions. As she wrote, the crew's laughter echoed faintly in her mind. She thought about the way Sarah had looked at her, the way Jenna had smirked, and the way they had whispered as if she couldn't hear. They had assumed she was just another passenger, someone they could mock without consequence. What they didn't know was that Mia Daniels wasn't just another traveler passing through the airport. She wasn't someone who would let their behavior go unnoticed. Mia closed her notebook and slipped it back into her bag. She sat back in her chair, her expression calm once more. She had a plan forming in her mind, a course of action that would ensure the crew learned a valuable lesson. As she waited for her flight to board, Mia couldn't help but reflect on how often people judged others based on appearances. It was a lesson she had learned early in life: never underestimate anyone, because you never know their story or their potential. The boarding call came over the speakers, and passengers began lining up at the gate. Mia stood and joined the line, her ticket in hand. She felt the eyes of the crew on her as she approached, their expressions a mixture of amusement and indifference. "Have a nice flight," Sarah said as she scanned Mia's ticket, her tone flat. Mia met her gaze with a small smile. "Thank you," she said simply, stepping onto the jet bridge. Little did the crew know, the passenger they had laughed at and dismissed was about to change their lives in ways they couldn't imagine. As Mia settled into her seat, her demeanor remained composed. The same grace she displayed at the counter carried over, but inwardly, her mind was alight with thoughts. The interaction had stirred something within her, a blend of anger and determination. The cabin buzzed with the usual pre-flight activity, passengers stowing their luggage, flight attendants ushering stragglers into their seats, and the faint murmur of conversations filling the air. Mia placed her carry-on neatly under the seat in front of her and fastened her seat belt. The airline crew who had mocked her earlier walked up and down the aisle, their faces neutral as they performed their duties. But as one of them passed Mia, there was the faintest flicker of recognition, followed by a quickly concealed smirk. Mia noticed, of course, but she didn't react. Instead, she maintained her composure, letting the moment pass without acknowledgement. For now. The plane's engines roared to life, and soon they were airborne, leaving the airport and its buzzing chaos behind. The view outside the window was breathtaking, endless blue skies and clouds that looked like cotton candy. But Mia's attention wasn't on the scenery. Her focus was on the notebook she had pulled out again, open on her lap. The attendants began their service shortly after takeoff, moving briskly through the aisles with carts of drinks and snacks. Mia observed them carefully, noting every detail, the way their smiles seemed forced, the subtle impatience in their movements, and, most of all, how differently they treated various passengers. When the cart reached Mia's row, the lead attendant, Sarah, glanced at her with an expression that was far from warm. "Something to drink?" she asked, her tone flat. "Water, please," Mia replied, her voice polite yet firm. Sarah handed her a cup without making eye contact, then moved on to the next passenger. Mia watched as Sarah's demeanor shifted, her tone suddenly pleasant as she addressed a man in a suit. "Would you like anything else? Perhaps some wine?" Sarah asked, her voice lilting with artificial sweetness. The man smiled, clearly pleased with the attention. "No, just water is fine, thank you." Sarah handed him a bottle of water instead of the small cup she had given Mia, her smile lingering as she moved down the aisle. Mia's lips pressed into a thin line. The contrast was stark and deliberate, and it spoke volumes about Sarah's attitude. But Mia didn't let the slight faze her. Instead, she reached for her pen and jotted down another note in her notebook. Unequal treatment of passengers, inconsistent service based on perceived status. The flight continued uneventfully for a while, but the tension in the air was palpable to Mia. She could see through the polished exteriors of the crew, their practiced smiles barely masking their true attitudes. She noticed the subtle glances they exchanged when passengers made requests and the way they seemed to avoid interacting with certain individuals altogether. A small incident in the middle of the flight only reinforced Mia's observations. A woman traveling with a young child was struggling to calm her toddler, whose cries had started to draw attention from nearby passengers. The mother looked flustered, her face red with embarrassment as she tried to soothe her child. Nancy, another member of the crew, approached the mother, her expression stern. "Ma'am, could you please quiet your child? It's disturbing other passengers," she said, her tone devoid of empathy. The mother looked up, her voice trembling. "I'm trying, but he's teething. I can't get him to stop crying." Nancy sighed audibly, clearly annoyed. "Well, please do your best. We can't have this kind of disruption for the whole flight." The mother's face fell, and she turned back to her child, rocking him gently and whispering soothing words. Mia felt a pang of sympathy. The scene was unnecessarily harsh, and it was clear that the crew's attitude wasn't helping the situation. Mia reached into her bag and pulled out a small travel kit. She stood up and approached the mother, offering her a teething toy. "Here, try this," Mia said with a kind smile. The mother looked up, her eyes brimming with gratitude. "Thank you so much, she said, taking the toy and offering it to her child, whose cries began to subside. As Mia returned to her seat, she noticed Nancy watching her, her expression a mix of annoyance and confusion. It was clear she hadn't expected anyone to step in, let alone a fellow passenger. Mia wrote another note in her notebook. Lack of compassion from crew toward families with children. The rest of the flight passed with little incident, but Mia's notebook was now filled with observations. Each note was a piece of a larger puzzle, one that painted a clear picture of the crew's unprofessional and discriminatory behavior. When the plane began its descent, Mia felt a sense of calm wash over her. She had everything she needed, and her plan was clear. The crew had spent the flight underestimating her, but they were about to learn a lesson they would never forget. As the plane touched down and passengers began gathering their belongings, Mia waited patiently in her seat. She was in no rush, preferring to let the others disembark first. The crew stood by the exit, their smiles plastered on as they wished each passenger a pleasant day. When it was finally Mia's turn, she approached the exit with the same calm confidence she had displayed throughout the flight. Nancy was the first to speak, her voice cheerful but insincere. "Thank you for flying with us," she said. Mia met her gaze, her expression unreadable. "Oh, you'll be hearing from me soon," she said, her tone calm but firm. Nancy's smile faltered, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face. As Mia stepped off the plane and into the terminal, she felt a sense of determination settle over her. The crew had laughed at her, dismissed her, and judged her based on their own biases. But they had no idea who she was or the authority she wielded. Mia settled into her seat in the economy section, positioning her bag neatly beneath the seat in front of her. The hum of passengers stowing their luggage and murmuring filled the cabin, but her attention was focused elsewhere. At the front of the plane, the same crew members who had mocked her earlier were clustered together, laughing and whispering. They seemed oblivious to the watchful eyes of the passengers they were supposed to serve. One of the attendants, Sarah, let out a loud laugh and leaned toward her colleague, Jenna. Their conversation was barely muffled, and although the specific words were indistinct, the tone was unmistakable, mocking, dismissive, and unprofessional. Mia's gaze remained calm, but her mind was working. She had learned long ago that reacting in the moment often gave people the satisfaction they sought. Instead, she chose to observe. She had always been an expert at reading people, at noting the small details that others overlooked. The flight attendants began their routine service shortly after takeoff, pushing carts of beverages and snacks down the narrow aisle. Mia watched as they interacted with passengers, their attitudes varying noticeably depending on whom they were speaking to. To the elderly couple in the row ahead, Sarah was brusque and impatient, barely pausing to hear their requests before moving on. To the young man in a tailored suit, her demeanor softened, her smile bright and almost flirtatious. When she reached Mia's row, the change was palpable. "Drink?" Sarah asked, her tone clipped as she avoided making eye contact. "Water, please," Mia said. Sarah handed her a cup of water without a word, moving on to the next passenger before Mia could say anything further. The contrast in her behavior was glaring, and it wasn't lost on Mia. As the flight continued, Mia noticed similar patterns in the crew's interactions with other passengers. A woman struggling to fit her carry-on into the overhead compartment was met with an exasperated sigh and a dismissive "You'll have to check that." Meanwhile, a man with a clearly oversized bag received a polite smile and assistance in finding space. Passengers began exchanging glances, the unease spreading. Quiet murmurs filled the cabin, with phrases like rude and unprofessional drifting through the air. Mia remained silent, her face unreadable as she pulled out her notebook and began jotting down notes. Crew prioritizing certain passengers over others. Dismissive attitude toward women, elderly passengers. Unequal assistance based on perceived status. She wrote quickly but deliberately, capturing every detail she could observe. To an outsider, it might have seemed like she was merely passing the time, but there was an intensity in her movements, a sense of purpose that hinted at something deeper. As the attendants continued their rounds,